From its first episode, CastleVania showed that it was going to be about more than just vampires bad, humans good. In fact, for the first few minutes, Dracula was treated as the protagonist, only turning genocidal after humans broke the peace. By letting us sympathize with Dracula before turning him into a villain, CastleVania began exploring its primary theme, the nature of good and evil. In this video, we'll look at how CastleVania explored this idea over 4 seasons, and what conclusions it came to in the end. In the world of CastleVania, evil is presented as a choice. No antagonists were bad just for the sake of it, with maybe one exception we'll talk about later. In general, something led to every villain's actions. And by looking at what drove them and what resulted, the story grapples with the question of what it means to be evil. There were generally 2 types of villains in CastleVania. First, there were the standard foes that didn't have any particular ambition besides spreading destruction and feeding. These were mostly vampires and night creatures that usually served as henchmen. Then, there were the main antagonists that sought to achieve a particular goal. Dracula and Isaac wanted to extinguish the human race. Hector sought to cull the race, Carmilla hoped to take over the world, and Saint Germain hoped to reunite with a loved one. Although each of these villains have different goals and motivations, they all share a common thread. Each is driven by intense emotion. Dracula and Saint Germain were both driven by love that was taken from them. With Dracula's loss, he went into a rageful vendetta against humanity. Saint Germain was driven to undo his loss and was willing to do whatever it took, including manipulating, killing, and other horrible things. Hector and Isaac were both abused as children and turned their anger against humanity as a whole. And finally, Carmilla spent a lifetime under the thumb of men. The one who turned her into a vampire grew old and cruel, so she killed him, and from then on, vowed to take revenge by taking everything from the stupid old men of the world. What's the common thread? Each of these characters become antagonists by giving in. Each felt rage, love, or spite, and gave in to that intense emotion, and as a result, they lost the ability to think clearly about a couple of important questions. Is what they are doing right? And will it make them happy? In any instance where a villain is subjected to either line of questioning, their flawed logic becomes apparent. Even in episode 1, Alucard tells Dracula that he should limit his revenge to only those responsible. If he lets loose an army of night creatures on Wallachia, thousands of innocents will die. Dracula's response is,
"There are no innocents! Not anymore!"
His response is an angry outburst, holding everyone responsible for the actions of a few. Similarly, in Season 3, a ship captain points out the flaws in Isaac's logic. Isaac claims humanity is cruel, but the ship captain points out that just yesterday, a man gave Isaac a gift and made a joke. He points out that Isaac only remembers those that tried to run him out of town. He is cherry-picking to paint humanity with a broad brush. People are cruel, but the ship captain proves that there is also good, which Isaac's anger causes him to ignore. Allowing oneself to be led by emotion means losing the ability to think logically. It means painting with a broad brush, blaming many for the actions of a few, and using that blame to justify atrocities. It also means losing any chance at happiness. In Season 4, Lenore asks Carmilla directly if taking the world will make her happy, and she admits it probably won't. Striga and Morana come to a similar realization. Once they're in the field, away from Carmilla, they understand that controlling the world will mean constantly defending against potential uprisings. It'll mean being separated rather than enjoying their love for one another. No villain in CastleVania finds anything resembling joy, unless they choose to reform. The less ambitious first category of villains, the standard vampires and night creatures, follow a similar pattern. They also give in, not to some intense emotion, but their perceived nature. In Season 4, Isaac offers one of his night creatures a berry, but the creature points out that, as a night creature, he eats blood and meat. It goes on, "Night creatures kill, destroy, and despoil." He is confused why Isaac offers him a berry and has them building a town, creating instead of destroying. So Isaac proves a point by insisting he tastes the fruit. The night creature does and enjoys it. He remembers his life prior to hell, and Isaac points out that no tool for destruction would taste a berry and remember the time in its first life when it encountered them. A night creature's need to kill, destroy, and despoil is a belief, not some unchangeable part of their nature. Evil is making the choice not to think, but to instead give in to a perceived nature or some emotion like fear, anger, or spite. But as Isaac proves in this scene, one can overcome their nature. A night creature can enjoy a berry or build a town. This conflict between thinking and not thinking is on display from CastleVania's first minutes. Dracula was a man of science, a field dedicated to thinking and the pursuit of knowledge. He was destroyed by humans giving in to their fear of what they don't understand, a fear of knowledge. This was CastleVania's first villain, and set the stage for the rest of its antagonists, similarly making the choice not to think, but to instead give themselves up to a force of nature or feeling. In fact, when we join Isaac in Season 4, turning to a more noble cause, he specifically asks himself, "Is it so bad to take my time and think for a moment?" That thinking is the first step away from evil and the first step towards good. And what does CastleVania have to say about being good? Does it mean to simply not be evil? According to Dracula, it takes more than that. In the first episode, when he tells Alucard that there are no innocents, he adds, "Any one of them could have stood up and said no, we won't behave like animals anymore." According to him, staying out of the way isn't enough, and Trevor actually echoes this sentiment in episode 2. At the time, he was fine letting Dracula's forces kill the people of Wallachia. After all, they cast out the Belmont family, so why should he bother to help them? The elder speaker retorts that the ordinary people of Wallachia didn't have a choice. Trevor disagrees, saying, "For evil bastards to win power, all ordinary people have to do is stand aside and keep quiet. There's always a choice." At the time, he missed the irony that he was describing himself, standing aside and keeping quiet. But it doesn't take long for him to make the choice to instead fight for the people who can't protect themselves. And over the next 4 seasons, Trevor continues to fight, alongside Alucard and Sypha, but eventually they find even that isn't enough. Season 4 finds them trapped in an endless cycle of fighting similar foes over and over. Belmont vents his frustrations in the season premiere, saying, "We killed Dracula, and now we have to spend the rest of our lives making sure nobody brings him back from the dead? This is not what I signed up for." They are not freed from that cycle until they have a realization later in the season, a realization that Isaac has a little earlier. In Season 3, Isaac kills an evil wizard that enslaved a town. In the aftermath of that, in Season 4, he reflects that it felt good to kill the man. It felt just, like Isaac was repairing the world a little. This makes him reflect on how he has spent his whole life reacting to things, never acting. But he wants to change that. "I can create futures," he says. Isaac abandons his old life dedicated to destruction, and instead decides to be a leader and help to build a better future. Something the ship captain suggested to him a season earlier. He tells Hector that he'll take over Carmilla's castle and run things better than Dracula did. Instead of only living in the now, surviving, he will consider the future. He will build something new, something where people can live for a future, he says. The last time we see Isaac, he is doing something we had not seen previously. We see him smiling. He realizes that the ideal is being proactive, creating, and building. He couldn't be happy in his previous life dedicated to punishing the world, but now he has learned what it is to be good, and what it is that humanity should strive for. Trevor and Sypha come to a similar realization. Like Isaac, they spent a long time reacting to things, but about halfway through Season 4, they finally decide to plant their feet and be proactive. Sypha starts reminding people how to build a town and how to live properly. They finally get into Targovishta's underground court, and thinking about the future, Trevor looks for more pieces of an antique, one that will come in handy later. Meanwhile, at his castle, Alucard welcomes villagers to move in and form a settlement. Just like Isaac, Trevor, and Sypha, he has joined an effort to build something. Even Hector, when asked by Isaac what he would like to do, says, "I want to read and make things and think." As Dracula and Trevor said in Season 1, being good means not standing aside and letting evil take charge. 3 seasons later, Trevor and these other characters learn that even that is not enough. To truly be good or great, you need to extinguish evil, but also be proactive. You need to think and make things. In my review, I said that Death as the final antagonist felt like it came a little out of left field. From a plot standpoint, I still think that's the case and wish more seeds were planted for it. However, thematically, I understand why he was the final boss. By the end of the series, our characters finally learned what it means to be evil and what it means to be good. Some villains renounced their ways and turned to the side of good. Others perished with the old world. With this new understanding and dedication to building a future, thematically it's appropriate that they would finally defeat the ultimate evil. At the start of this video, I mentioned that there may be one purely evil character. The character of Death is an elemental being that represents the exact opposite of human ideals. As Trevor says to him, "You're only a thing. You're only an old killer. You don't make anything. You don't live. You just eat and hide." And he adds, "It's time to give this place back to people who know how to build things. You and me, we're just killers out of history. It's time for us to go." Humanity's ideals are life and creation. Death represents death and consumption, the exact opposite of what we strive for. So with our characters finally ready to embrace their ideals and look toward the future, they're given the opportunity to slay Death. And it was only possible because Trevor was thinking about the future. He collected artifacts throughout the season because he knew they may come in handy later. Literally killing Death is not a subtle metaphor, but it represents the ultimate victory. Sure, they slayed Carmilla and stopped the formation of the Rebus, but there are always more villains. Killing Death is CastleVania's way of saying, this wasn't just killing a villain of the week. These characters are taking a real step forward for humanity, and no longer just reacting or surviving. The opening scene of the finale is a great representation of what this means. As a human, Hector couldn't be happier. He finally gets to live according to the way humans should live. But Lenore's ideals are different, and in this new world, her mood is a lot more sullen. She points out that a vampire's virtue is stability. They aren't big on change. She doesn't fit into the new world, and as a result, decides to leave it and lets herself burn away in the sunlight. The sad thing is, she may have had a chance in the new world. Striga and Morana decided to give it a try, and Isaac proved with his night creatures that their nature is fluid. But Lenore saw her nature as something unchangeable, focused on consumption rather than creation. So she gave into it and gave up her life as a result. If I were to sum up CastleVania's views on good and evil, I'd say that to be good is to think and create. To be evil is to succumb and consume. It also says that your experience of life will tell you when you're living properly. The characters that embrace evil end up miserable. Only those that embrace good eventually find happiness. That's a really positive outlook, and one that I love to see since it's rare these days. In current pop culture, we seem to have embraced the idea of heroes as self-sacrificing, tortured souls. Being good often means giving up any hope of a normal life, or sometimes any hope of living at all. CastleVania says that's not necessarily true. Being good means at least having a shot at also being happy. Anyway, I think we can wrap it up there. For a show that started on such a dark note, I was pleasantly surprised by CastleVania's optimistic ending. Though we know things won't stay peaceful forever, because about 300 years later, Sypha and Trevor's great-great-great and a few more greats grandson, Richter Belmont, will have some new threat to contend with. But until then, let me know your thoughts on CastleVania in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more just like it. With that, thank you for watching.